Sorella didn't cry when her feet split open. She just pulled the hem of her soot-black skirt lower and kept walking. The boy on her hip, barely 4, stirred only once to whisper, "Mama?" before falling back asleep against her shoulder. The town behind them had burned for nearly a day. First the cabin, then her reputation. They'd called her witch for sheltering Lakota orphans, spat at her door when the cholera took their preacher's wife, and locked her out of the schoolhouse when she begged for bread. So she walked. No wagon, no boots, no map, just feet blistered by prairie heat and ash, and a skirt long enough to hide the shame she carried. When the wind shifted, she smelled pine, mountains, water, a better place. But her legs trembled now, and her toes bled inside stiff stockings. She reached a ridge just before dusk and collapsed behind a rock, clutching the boy close. A lone bird circled above, then another. She closed her eyes. If the wolves took them, at least it would be quiet. But what came wasn't a howl. It was the thud of a horse, then soft footfalls, and then silence. She opened one eye. A man stood there. Lakota, leather shirt open to the chest, dark braids resting like ropes on his shoulders, a bow on his back but no arrow drawn. He didn't move. His eyes, sharp and still as river stones, settled on the child, then on her. She waited for him to speak, to judge, to turn away like all the rest. But he did none of those things. He knelt, slowly, and placed something on the ground before her. A blanket, woven, dark red, warm. Sorella tried to speak, but her throat cracked with dust. The man reached into his pouch and pulled out a water skin, setting it beside the blanket. Then he stood and walked away. No questions, no threats, just presence. She stared after him, the boy still breathing against her collarbone, and finally let herself believe that maybe someone out here could see her without recoiling. She pulled the blanket over them and didn't even try to sleep. All she could feel were the pulsing fires beneath her skin where her feet had once been whole. But morning was coming. She could smell it. And somewhere nearby, a stranger had left kindness behind. She woke to birdsong and the slow ache of feet that had fused pain into her bones. The boy stirred first, rubbing his face against her arm. His name was Levi, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in days. She sat up carefully, wincing as dried blood cracked beneath her heels. The red blanket had slipped off during the night, and now lay folded beside her, neat as though returned by unseen hands. For a moment she thought she'd imagined the man. But then she saw the bowl, steam still rising, filled with thick porridge and forest berries, left on a flat stone nearby. And beside it, a pair of soft deerskin moccasins, tied with rawhide laces and small enough for her feet. Her hands trembled as she reached for them. She hadn't worn shoes in days, couldn't afford to, wouldn't have accepted them, except now her soles were torn beyond pride. She pressed her fingers into the leather, still warm. Whoever he was, he'd come again. Watched, maybe. Waited. And still, no demands. No name, no voice, just provisions. She didn't trust it, not fully, but hunger outweighed suspicion, so she fed Levi first, cooling the porridge with her breath. The boy ate in silence, his eyes glassy from too many nights without dreams. Only when his bowl was empty did she eat, and as she swallowed the last spoonful, something inside her loosened. She stood, testing the moccasins. They fit. Not perfectly, but well enough to protect the burned skin. She gathered the blanket, hoisted Levi again, and started walking toward the trees where the scent of smoke teased her. Within minutes, she found the camp. It wasn't large, just a hide tent, a fire ring, and a single horse tied to a juniper branch. The Lakota warrior sat cross-legged beside the fire, carving something small with a bone knife. He didn't flinch when she stepped forward. Didn't speak. Just looked up once and met her eyes, then returned to his work. She didn't know what to say. Gratitude felt too fragile, too exposed. Instead, she sat across from him without asking. Levi asleep on her lap. The silence wrapped around them like something living. He finished his carving, a small wooden bird, and set it on a stone between them. A gift, or a sign, or maybe just a story he didn't know how to tell in her tongue. Her hands moved on their own, pulling the hem of her skirt lower, hiding the scars again. He noticed, but said nothing. Still, she saw it in his eyes. He already knew what she was hiding. That night, the warrior made no fire, just embers. Enough warmth to keep the cold at bay, not enough to reveal what she refused to let be seen. Sorella wrapped Levi in the red blanket and lay curled around him, but her eyes never left the man who sat a few yards away, legs folded, spine straight, as still as stone. His name was a mystery. He hadn't asked hers. Still, there was something in the way he occasionally glanced toward her, never too long, never probing, that told her she wasn't invisible to him, just not hunted. That was new. She'd spent her whole life watched like prey. At dawn, he rose and walked into the trees without a word. Sorella thought about fleeing then. She could go west, maybe find a rail line, a station, someplace where people forgot their own names long enough to give her a new one. But her feet pulsed when she stood, sending hot sparks up her calves. The moccasins were soft, but the damage beneath was not. And Levi, he needed food, stillness, water. She sat again. When the warrior returned, he carried a rabbit already skinned and 2 pine gourds filled with clear stream water. He didn't offer explanations. He just handed them over and nodded once before tending to the fire. As he cooked, she watched him work. Efficient, gentle, like someone used to being trusted. She hadn't known men like that could exist. After they ate, she tried to wash her feet behind the tent, wincing as she peeled back the damp cloth. The burns had blistered, then broken, then hardened into cracked skin that bled when she stepped wrong. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. When she turned to re-wrap them, he was there, watching. Her skirt was still lifted halfway up her calves. She yanked it down, heart slamming in her chest. He didn't speak, just took a step forward. She shook her head. Don't. But he knelt anyway, slowly, like approaching a wounded doe. She froze. His hands didn't reach for her. They reached for the edge of the hem she'd just dropped. And in a voice deep and calm as river stone, he said the first words she'd heard from him since he'd found her. "These walked you to me." Her throat tightened. The words didn't feel like praise. They felt like truth. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her like she'd done something sacred, like her steps meant something, like her scars were part of a journey she'd survived. She should have pulled away. Any other man would have stared at her feet with revulsion, or worse, sympathy. But he didn't recoil, didn't hesitate. He looked as though he were memorizing a map only he could read, one etched in ash and torn skin. Sorella stood frozen, breath caught between shame and disbelief, until she felt his fingers brush the hem of her skirt again. Not to lift, but to hold it in place so the wind wouldn't bear more than she meant to reveal. Then, with a cloth dipped in warmed water, he cleaned the wounds. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't said a word. But he moved with such care, each motion as if she were made of breath and bone china. Her eyes stung, not from the pain, but from the quiet. No one had touched her without demand or consequence, since before her husband's fists learned her skin. And now this man, this stranger, was kneeling in dust, honoring what others had called ruin. When he finished, he tied fresh bandages from strips of his own tunic and slipped the moccasins gently back over her feet. Then he stood, said nothing more, and disappeared again into the trees. Sorella collapsed into herself the moment he was gone, covering her face with her hands. She hated how much it had meant, how something so simple, so human, felt like it had cracked open her ribs and poured heat into her chest. That night she couldn't sleep, not because of pain, but because her body didn't know how to rest when it wasn't braced for harm. She watched the stars blink overhead and listened to Levi's soft breathing beside her. In the morning she found another offering, a carved flute beside the fire, small enough for a child's hands. Levi clutched it immediately, placing it to his lips and making nothing but squeaks. Still, he smiled. And for the first time in weeks, Sorella did too. Later, the warrior returned with a branch of wild chokecherries and a pouch of crushed herbs. He set them beside her and finally spoke again. "For swelling," he said. His voice wasn't deep. It was gentle, like the first breeze after a storm. She looked up. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. He met her gaze. "Because you kept walking." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. In his tribe, perhaps, walking meant something more than distance. It meant will, spirit, refusal to die when dying would have been easier. She looked down at her feet, raw, ugly, healed only in patches, and for the first time, didn't hide them. They stayed near the ridge for 4 days. Not because she asked to, but because the warrior, whose name she now knew was Tama, never rushed her. He would vanish in the morning mist and return with things she didn't know she needed. Smoked fish wrapped in bark, a blanket stitched with pine needles, a clay pot filled with steeped herbs that smelled like bitter earth, but dulled the ache in her calves. Each night, he carved. Tiny animals, birds, a turtle, a bear cub. He'd place one beside Levi's sleeping body like a blessing, then retreat to the edge of camp and sit with the silence like it was a friend. Sorella hadn't spoken much, but she listened, watched, wondered. On the 5th day, she tried to help. She limped to the river and knelt to scrub their clothes against the rocks. Her legs shook, but her hands stayed steady. Tama saw her from the tree line, but didn't interfere. That night, he placed another carved bird near the fire, larger than the others, with wings outstretched. He set it between them and said, "Tomorrow we go." She didn't ask where. She didn't need to. Something in her trusted him now, not blindly, but like a tree trusts the soil once it's survived the frost. She nodded. That night, she told him her name. "Sorella." He repeated it softly, as though it mattered, as though it belonged. Then, for the first time since arriving, she told him about the fire. Not just the one that burned her feet, but the slow burn of a town that never forgave her for sheltering those Lakota children. The whispers, the threats, the rocks through her window. "They said I betrayed my kind," she murmured. Tama's eyes narrowed. "What kind is that?" She looked at him then, really looked, at the scar above his brow, the way his braids were tied with strips of blue cloth, the quiet power in how he sat. "The kind that thinks kindness is weakness," she said. He didn't reply, just reached for the bird carving and handed it to her. "This one flies," he said. She turned it over in her palm. Its wings were rough-hewn but wide, capable. She held it close, then tucked it into the pouch that held Levi's extra moccasins. The path ahead was still unknown, but for the first time, She didn't feel like she was just running from something. She was walking toward something, too, even if her feet weren't ready yet. The morning came with mist curling between the trees, wrapping around the trunks like old secrets. Sorella wrapped Levi in the red blanket, tied it to her back, and stepped forward with Tama beside her. Each footfall sent a whisper of pain up her spine, but she didn't ask to stop. She wanted him to see that she could move forward without being carried. Tama didn't offer his horse. He didn't reach to steady her. He just walked close enough that if she fell, she wouldn't fall far. The forest deepened as they descended the ridge, crossing through a narrow canyon where stones glistened with last night's rain. Hours passed. Her breath grew ragged. Her right foot began to bleed again. She gritted her teeth. Tama paused once to offer water, but when she lifted her skirt to examine the wound, she flinched. Not from the blood, but from the shame. He saw, and again, didn't flinch. He knelt, unwrapped the moccasin, cleaned the foot in silence, and whispered, "Still walking?" 2 words, that was all. But they sank into her like sunlight through frost. She hadn't cried in weeks. Not when they dragged her through the street. Not when she buried the orphan boy she couldn't save. Not even when Levi went days without milk. But now, kneeling on the trail, with this quiet man tying a strip of his own sash around her bleeding arch, she wept. Not loud, not messy, just enough to breathe again. Tama didn't speak. He simply stood, offered her his hand, not as a crutch, but as a choice. She took it. They reached a clearing by nightfall, where the trees broke open and a circle of low lodges waited near a slow-moving creek. Children played in the shallows. An elder woman stirred a pot over fire. No one ran at the sight of her. No one stared. A boy offered Levi a carved whistle. A girl wrapped warm cloth around Sorella's shoulders without a word. Tama turned to her. "This is where we stop," he said. She looked around, dazed by the gentleness of it all. "For how long?" she asked. He shrugged. "As long as your feet need." Her breath hitched. She reached for Levi, who clutched her with sleepy arms and sighed. She looked down at her stained skirt, the dried blood, the skin that would never be smooth again. She didn't hide it this time. And no one asked her to. She had walked farther than pain. And now, for the first time, she stood somewhere it couldn't follow. Sorella didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, there was none, but because her mind wouldn't stop listening to the quiet. Real quiet. No shouting. No footsteps pacing the porch. No Levi whimpering in his dreams. Just the soft hum of crickets, the occasional hiss of fire, and the slow exhale of people who weren't afraid. She lay beneath a buffalo hide roof, curled beside her son, but her eyes stayed fixed on the woven beams above. Her feet throbbed, wrapped in clean cloth and sweetgrass balm. They still looked like something burned from the earth, but now they felt noticed. Honored, even. In the morning, she rose before the sun and stepped outside. A cool breeze brushed against her face. She stood barefoot in the grass, testing her steps. It still hurt, but the pain no longer felt like punishment. It felt like memory. Tama was already awake, sharpening a flint blade beside the creek. He looked up when she approached, eyes unreadable but open. "I want to help," she said. He nodded once. No lecture, no ceremony, just trust. He led her to a row of drying hides. An elder woman with silver braids showed her how to stretch and scrape the leather with a curved bone tool. It was hard work. Her arms ached, her back pinched, but with each motion something inside her realigned, not with words, with rhythm, with worth. That afternoon, Levi chased butterflies by the creek while two boys taught him how to sling pebbles at a driftwood target. Sorella watched from a flat stone, her hands busy with stitching, her feet bare and sunlit. The red blanket lay folded beside her, no longer something to hide beneath, but something she could offer. At dusk, Tama approached again. He crouched beside her, holding a new pair of moccasins, different from the last. These were darker, beaded at the toe, sewn with rawhide thongs. He held one out. "These are for where you're going," he said. She took them slowly, fingers tracing the beadwork. "Where am I going?" she whispered. He looked at her. Not her face, not her feet, but all of her. "That's for you to choose now." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes were wet again, but this time with something lighter, something rising. She set the moccasins in her lap and looked down at her burned feet, exposed, scarred, and still somehow sacred. And for the first time, she didn't flinch. The blanket stayed on the ground. She stayed with the tribe longer than she meant to. What was supposed to be rest turned into routine, helping scrape hides, stirring stew, collecting herbs with the old women who didn't speak her tongue, but spoke to her anyway with their eyes and their hands. Levi began to speak Lakota words before he spoke full English sentences again. He laughed now, full belly sounds that split the air like sunlight through smoke. The people didn't ask where she came from. They didn't question her scars or whisper about the skirt that sometimes still caught on her bandages. They simply made room. And Tama, he didn't hover. He didn't push. He walked beside her some mornings and left her alone others. But he always carved. Each night, he added another animal to Levi's growing collection. One evening, he carved a wolf, sleek and strong, with its head tilted toward the sky. "Why that one?" she asked, as Levi turned it over in small hands. "Because wolves follow the one who walks ahead," Tama said, "not the one who waits to be led." She didn't answer, but something in her heart flinched at that, like a door unlocking. One evening, during a gathering by the fire, the elder woman who had first offered her balm brought her forward. She painted a thin line of white ash down the center of Sorella's forehead, then placed her burned feet into a basin of warm river water mixed with cedar and crushed berries. Sorella tensed until Tama knelt before her again, like he had on the ridge, and rested his hands on either side of the basin. "This is not healing," the elder said in slow, broken English. "This is honoring." Sorella looked around. The others watched in silence, not with pity, with reverence. Levi clung to her leg, holding the wooden wolf. Tama's voice came next, low and even. "Some fires destroy, some choose you." Her lip trembled. She tried to laugh it off, but nothing came. Just the weight of it, the truth. The fire hadn't just broken her. It had burned away everything false, everything fearful, and left her with feet that had carried her to a life no one else could have walked into but her. When the basin was emptied, she stood, without shame. The ash on her forehead glowed in the firelight. Her feet were red and cracked and whole. And when she looked at Tama, he didn't smile. He simply nodded, like he'd seen this version of her all along. The first time she danced, it wasn't for anyone. No circle, no drums, just the hush of dusk and the breeze playing in the cottonwoods. She stepped barefoot through the soft dirt outside the lodge, the hem of her skirt lifted slightly by her fingertips. Not to hide anything, but to feel the earth with skin that had once blistered in silence. Each step pressed into her soles like memory and release. Levi watched from a stone, clapping softly, wooden wolf in his lap. Tama stood at a distance, arms folded, eyes steady but unreadable. When she stopped, breathless and flushed, he approached. "You didn't fall," he said. She smirked. "Did you think I would?" He shook his head. Number I waited. She didn't ask what he meant, but she knew. He hadn't just been waiting for her to heal. He'd been waiting for her to choose. That night, she slipped on the new moccasins. They fit differently than the first pair. Firmer. More hers. She stitched a single white bead into the ankle seam. Her own mark. Her own thread. The tribe didn't treat her like a guest anymore. They sent her out to gather root bulbs with the women, trusted her to tend the cooking stones when the fires burned high. Levi had his own chores now, fetching kindling, feeding the hound pup that had started sleeping at their door. They belonged. Quietly. Fully. One morning, Tama found her sitting by the creek, washing Levi's tunic in the shallows. He sat beside her, close enough that their knees touched. After a long silence, he asked, "If you had turned the other way that night, where would you be?" She didn't hesitate. "Dead, or wishing I was. But you walked." "I did. And your feet carried you here." She looked down at them, still raw in places, but strong now. "Yes, they did." Tama leaned back on his elbows, gaze skyward. "You know what my mother used to say?" She turned. "What?" "Every woman walks through fire, but some carry it inside them after." She didn't reply for a long moment. Then she said, "I think mine still burns." He glanced at her. "Good. It means you're still walking." And with that, he stood, offered his hand, not out of duty, not to help her up, but to walk beside her. She took it, moccasins pressing into the wet earth, and rose. Not to escape, not to flee, but to go forward finally, without hiding what had carried her this far. Spring came slowly, unfolding like a secret, buds on cottonwood branches, fat trout returning to the creek, children shedding winter furs for linen tunics. Sorella no longer counted days. The woman she'd been, trailing ash and silence, belonged to another season. Now, when she stepped into the sun, no one looked away. Levi laughed louder, grew stronger. His Lakota had outpaced hers, but he still called her Mama, with a softness that reminded her of the first time he ever spoke the word. She wove baskets with the elders, carved root bundles for drying, tied feathers into the hound's fur before festivals. But it was her feet, those ruined, mended feet, that became the true offering. At the next moon dance, when drums echoed through the valley and fire rose into the open sky, she stepped barefoot into the circle. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for invitation. She walked into the center and lifted her hem high. Not to shock, but to show. Her soles bore scars, her arches puckered where skin never fully healed. But she didn't tremble. She spun slowly, moccasins tucked under her arm, letting the earth touch her again. And as she turned, the drums slowed, then stopped. The circle fell silent. Tama stepped forward, solemn, steady, and without breaking eye contact, he bent down, not to lift her, not to claim her, but to place something at her feet. A new pair of moccasins, this time sewn with red beads. She looked at them, then at him. "I don't need them," she said. "I know," he replied. "They're not for hiding. They're for remembering." She nodded, bent to pick them up, and held them close to her chest. A murmur passed through the tribe, not of confusion, but of respect. This woman, the one with burned feet, had walked through fire and still carried it with dignity. No one cheered, no one clapped, but every face held reverence. When she stepped back into the circle, the drums began again, not louder but deeper, and the earth beneath her felt different. Not like something she had crawled across, but like something she had shaped. That night, beneath stars sharp enough to cut, Tama stood beside her as Levi slept between them. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He only said, "You made your own trail." and she whispered, "Yes." But I didn't walk it alone. She looked down at her feet, bare in the dew, and for the first time in her life, she believed they were beautiful. Not because they were unscarred, but because they had brought her all the way home. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If someone had lifted the hem of your skirt, would they have found pain or power? Tell us in the comments.